I've been teaching web application development for a number of years now using ASP.NET. And one thing that students always have an issue with is seeding their database. So you create your web application that's like a database driven thing. Maybe there's some user accounts, people need to log in, and there's some other data. And you want some test data in there when you run it for the first time to see if things are working. To do that, you seed data in your database, and you do that in the C#. So you just run your code, and if the data isn't already there, it'll add it in there. You might also use it to just add some user accounts, so some like default accounts or accounts for your customers. So that's something people have found very difficult. For a long time, but especially since Microsoft updated to .NET Core. So .NET Core 1 was the first change, and people figured out how to do it for that. But then more recently, they've updated to Core 2.1, and that's changed things again. So what I thought I'd do is record a video showing you how to do it. So I've not started anything yet, so I'm going to create a new project. So new project, and it's going to be a .NET Core web application. I'm going to call it seed test. Click OK. And then what I'm going to do, so I'm targeting .NET Core 2.1, and I'm going to change the authentication to individual user accounts that sign up in-app, so that I can show you that side of things as well, not just the seeding data. It's going to be a really simple project, like super simple. So let's have a look. So we've got our basic stuff set up. But what I want to do first is to add a model. So I'm going to create a class. So add a class. Okay, you're not seeing some of it. Sorry, so I'm recording this on a screen where I've got like a dual monitor. So sorry about that. But I just created a class, and I'm going to call it, I'm going to be super boring. I'm not feeling in a creative mood today, so I'm just going to have contacts. So it's going to be a very basic thing. So prop ID, this will be our database primary key for our model. And then we want another property. So I'm typing prop, double tapping tab, and then that gives me this autocomplete here. So I'm going to do string and tab again through these and name. So like very simple thing, like you're a user and you have a list of contacts. We're not going to do much of the functionality today. Just the seeding is all we want to see. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set up, I'm going to use scaffolding to do this. Again, it's annoying that it's going in that direction. So if you right click on the, in fact what I can do is I can move it over here. Right, let's do that. So I'm right clicking on controllers, add controller, and then I'm going to use the scaffolding to set up a controller with views using the entity framework, which means then once we've done our seeding, we can just load up the application and see what's going on. So I'm going to click add. The model we're going to use is contact, and I'm going to use the application DB context that already exists because when we set up the project, I put authentication to user accounts. It's already got a data context for us to use, which is the one that it will be using for the application user. Now, if you're struggling to follow me so far, you probably want to go back and look at my other tutorials on how to set up these kind of projects. But I'm concentrating on the seeding today. So that's it. We're kind of done. If I look at my, now this is on the other side of the screen, this is really confusing for me. But if we look, we now have a contacts controller, and perhaps more importantly, in our data, we've got our application DB context. This is, so whenever you see this kind of DB context, we're talking about our database context, which we can then use to access the database without having to worry about SQL ourselves. Now, one thing I like to do is here, when you do the scaffolding, for some reason in the new version of in .NET Core, the convention changed from having your tables. Before it would have automatically called this contacts. Now I think that it makes more sense to be called contacts, because this is a table of contact. So there's contact. This model contact is in this table contacts. I think that makes more sense, so I just changed that. So how are we going to do? So what do we want to do when we're seeding a database? We basically want, when the web application first runs, we want it to check to see if there's anything in the database. And if there isn't, we want to add some test data. Now, when we run our, if I click run here, what would happen is that this is the main program that would run on the server. So in the case where I'm testing, it would be on a local server on my computer. And this is kind of the main thing. But then you've got this startup. Let's get rid of this. So we've got this startup class, which has a method called configure. And what we're going to be doing is, in this configure method, this is where we add all the middleware that we're using in our application. So we can see we're adding like MVC, authentication, various other things. We also want to add here, this is where we want to do our seeding. So to do our seeding, we first want to create a class that its entire job is going to be to do the seeding. Now I'm going to add that in our data folder. So I'm going to add a new class, and I'm going to call it DB initializer, or let's call it seeder. You could say database initializer if you wanted, but like we're talking about seeding. Let's call it seeder. Seeder is easier to spell as well. Now this class, I'm going to make it a static class so we can access it anywhere without having to instantiate it. Think about these as kind of helper functions. And then I'm going to make a method that is to basically seed the database. So I'm going to call it public. It's going to be a static as well. Void, it's not going to return anything. And I'm going to call it seed. Seed DB, seed database. And then here we're going to do the database seeding. So to seed the database, we need to actually get our data context. We need to get a reference to our data context or application DB context. And we're going to do that through dependency injection. And if that is a new term to you, then you need to do some reading on that. But that's a big deal in ASP.NET Core. So in short, what we can do is we can add to this method our database context. In fact, we're not technically. Are we using we're actually no. We're sorry. Yeah, we're not using dependency injection here. We're using that on the startup. I'll show you that in a second. Okay, so we've got somehow we're going to pass our database our context here. So our data context. Somehow we're going to pass that to this this method. So now we've got it, we can actually use some stuff. So the first thing I'm going to do is context.ensure. Context.database.ensure created. So what that's going to do is it's going to do exactly what it says. It's going to say, right, is there a database created? And if there isn't, it'll create one. And that means we can start adding things. So let's just add a new contact to that. So context dot contacts dot add, and let's put this here, and then we're going to have a new contact. So I'm going to have to, so I'll do this now. so it's added the models here because I haven't brought in the namespace, but probably what I want to do is do using seed test.models, and then I can get rid of this, which makes more sense. Otherwise I'd be having like models written everywhere there. So we added a name equals, let's just say sure. Okay, that's it. Okay, so that will add this to the contacts table, but we need to save our changes. So we're going to do context.save changes. Notice how I'm not using the async stuff here. I could do, but I'm not right now. So okay, so that does our database. Now, so this is adding our kind of model data. It's adding a contact. Now I also want to add a user. So if I'm going to add a user, I need to do a couple of things. So I'm going to need we're using core identity core. So I'm going to have to use Microsoft.ASP.NET Core.identity. And then, as well as the database context, so when you're using the identity framework, you're not going to be putting things in the database yourself. You're going to be using some manager classes to do that. So the one we'll be using first is the user manager. There's also a role manager if you need to put roles in. So I'm going to do user manager, and then we want our identity user, and then it's the user. Okay, so this is the default user class, and because we haven't made our own, we're just using that one here. So you can, if you were to make a class that inherited the identity user, then you can have your own custom user, which then has in it, you could add your own things to that rather than just the default, your own properties to that. So okay, let's add the user. So we want to make a new identity user. User equals new identity user. Now you have to be a bit careful here, because even though we're not creating, we're doing it correctly because we are using the user manager. But there is, if you give it invalid user data, then it will fail, and it won't seed in the database. There's also a thing where, so I'm going to do sean@email.com. That isn't my email address. At the moment, you need to make the username and email address the same, otherwise you will have problems. It's assumed these things are the same by default. So we've created our user object. Now all we need to do is add it. So user manager dot create async, and then we add the user, and then we give a password. So the password is, I'm just going to do password 123. Again, I'm just including lots of characters to make sure that's a valid password. And then I'm using the wait command because this is an async method. So I wasn't using async methods here. If I don't add this wait, then what will happen is that the process will start to create a user and the code will just continue running, and the seeding wouldn't work correctly. So it's important to say, look, we don't want to continue until this user has been added to the database, and that's something we're doing, right? We're saying we're seeding our stuff. We want to seed the database before we start the actual web application. Okay, so what's quite nice about seeding in this way is that the way you write this seeding method is the same as you would write any method in a controller or anything else where you're adding things to a database. So you could add things that have relationships with each other. You could add, if you were to add the functionality of having these contacts linked to users, you could add those links here. You could add roles, assign roles, all this kind of stuff, and it just is coded exactly the same way as you would when you're writing a controller, which means you need to learn how to do that. There are some other ways of seeding data in Core 2.1, which I haven't fully read into, but from a glance, I feel like you've probably got more control using this way. But feel free, point me into some directions of information about that if you know about it. Okay, what I'm going to do before I finish with this class is I don't like how I've got this method seed database is actually doing two jobs. It's seeding the contacts and it's seeding the users. So let's do some refactoring. Let's extract this method, called this seed contacts, and then we'll bring this one out to quick actions refactoring, extract method, seed users. And then we know that this is the only place we do these things, and that refactoring stuff is very clever. It's figured out that we need to pass this context and the user manager as well. So this is our class. So a lot of people I found can get this far, but then aren't sure where to call this. And this is where we are going to use dependency injection. So we're going to go to our startup method and class, and we're going to be doing it in configure. We're going to be wanting to do it after the authentication middleware has been loaded, otherwise that user manager ain't going to work. And this is where we use dependency injection. So what we can do is, because of the way dependency injection is working, if we want to grab an object, we can add it. We can basically overload this configure method. So there's lots of explanations on dependency injection, that kind of stuff out there, which I'll let you find. This is not a video about that. So we're going to add the user manager as well. Identity user. Have I spelled that wrong? Yeah, I then call that user manager. So by adding these, now I'm going to get I can get those references because of dependency injection. If you look at, this is how we do things now in controllers as well. So let's have a look at the controller. You can see in the constructor, we've added the data context to this constructor and we're grabbing it through dependency injection. So this is kind of the way of doing things. So we could add the user manager here as well, just like we have here. So we can do the same thing. And in previous versions, you had to do a lot more, a bit more work to get those references. So now that's it. Like now we just write so what do we call it? We called it db seeder dot cdb context user manager. So let's see if this works. I'm going to go to here so I know the data. So I'm going to then just run it. So something we didn't do is we didn't write any checks to see if that data already exists. So if I were to run this a couple of times, there'd be duplicate entries. The user manager, I don't think would. It would be clever enough to not do that. But that's something to bear in mind, is I haven't shown you the whole solution here. So I'm going to copy this password into my clipboard. And then let's see if we can log in. So Sean@email.com. Paste that. Okay, so I'm logged in. I'm fine. I should have disabled this. I'll forget it for now. And then let's see if our contacts are in there. So if I go to contacts, there it is. So there you have it. That's how to seed a database in ASP.NET Core 2.1. So I hope this has been helpful. If you like the video, like it. If you're interested in more of these kind of tutorials, subscribe. I teach at Swansea University, so I'm going to be posting a few of these. If you have any requests for different types of videos, different concepts, then do let me know, or other questions, put it in the comments. I am obviously prioritizing my students who pay for this stuff, but I think it's good to kind of make these kind of things available for everybody. So thanks for watching.